superheroes as a concept are vigilantes using their morality to make a judgment about someone else. Who watches the Watchmen is thematic. Who guards the guarders or who polices the police? Who decides whose morality is correct?
Look, Rorschach and I have made real headway on the gang problem by working together.
We can do so much more. We can save this world. It doesn't take a genius to see the world has problems.
Yeah, but it takes a room full of morons who think they're small enough for you to handle.
To take justice into your own hands, we're coming into a term which is known as vigilantism.
It generally happens in response to some sort of perceived threat to a community or some sort of sense that things are spinning wildly out of control.
I'm tired of being afraid. Afraid of war. Afraid of the mass killer.
This isn't a superhero story. This is an alternate history. This is what if somebody had the powers of a god? What would the world be like?
Of course, Watchmen is a product of its time. And at the time when it came out, I think it seemed that one of the major civil liberties issues of the future would be people acting on their own, vigilantes and other independent, non-governmental actors.
It was 1985. The crime was out of control. They were robbing, they were stealing, they were selling drugs in every corner. Crack was coming out.
And you would have to literally go through a phalanx of these thieves and robbers and modern-day terrorists who would dominate whole areas of a city, a neighborhood, a street, a subway, a bus. And so you had to constantly watch your back, and you knew you were on your own.
New York City, in certain places, you really took your life in your hands just walking a city block back then.
Back in the 80s, there was this real sense, I remember as a kid, that, oh, crime's out of control, things are getting worse.
It looks like the set from Escape from New York. You know, there's just smoke and rubble and armed gangs roaming the streets.
It's a funny thing that should have happened in the 80s, because of course the great vision of the 80s, Orwell's vision, was one of a police state where everybody was monitored all the time. The reality was very different. You were faced rather with an impotent state, a vanishing state, and the constant threat of riot and crime.
You see what takes place in the streets. You see anarchy. You see the breakdown of respect. You see there's no code of conduct. The philosophy of the guardian angels and what I tell all people is you've got to do something. On the first patrols, people were terrified of us. They saw young blacks, Hispanics, Asians, whites. We would get onto the car of the train, and they would immediately exit stage left as quickly as their feet could carry us. And 5-0, the police were hell-bent on locking us up and throwing away the key. I mean, in the first few years, I got arrested 76 times myself.
Oh, you got to join the gang, and the gang in my neighborhood were terrorizing the neighborhood. I didn't want to be a part of a gang that was terrorizing the neighborhood. I want to be the good guy.
When you were a teenage boy, you loved those guys. They didn't wait around for some kind of nanny state to take care of them. And they could kick ass like a criminal, except they weren't criminals, they were good guys.
We're physically trained. We must risk our life to stop a crime in progress. An average citizen, if they don't feel they're physically capable, must make noise, must make attention, must try to rally up the other citizens, even if it's from a safe distance. But you have to do something other than just call 911. To me, that is so weak. That is basically waving the flag of surrender, telling the criminals, if the police aren't around, you own this part of town.
If they take it upon themselves, instead of what they should do is call 911 and say, I think I'm observing a domestic disturbance, can the police come? And the police are just held to a higher standard of responsibility and accountability, which these individuals aren't.
Visita mi canal.
First name, response, ready!
It's a complicated subject. It's not something that can be, answered with a yes or no. It is not white or black. And for somebody to say that you always get involved, well, these are people that are not highly trained. Well, I take martial arts and I do this. All the martial arts aren't going to help you in the world if I have a .45.
We've taken down armed gunmen. We've taken down individuals who were firing weapons at the time. We've also, though, buried 6 guardian angels in the line of duty who were shot and killed or stabbed in the line of duty and then unfortunately gave their most precious gift, their life.
I know it sounds corny and I'm sorry, but I feel like I'm getting ready to do something. A lot of the guys feel quite pumped up when they throw on the uniform. It makes them feel like they're doing something important, something special.
Rorschach's Journal, October 12th, 1985. This city's afraid of me. I've seen its true face. The streets are extended gutters, and the gutters are full of blood. And when the drains finally scab over, all the vermin will drown. The accumulated filth of all their sex and murder will foam up around their waists. And all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us."
We accept in comic books that you put a costume on and go out into the night and fight crime, but really, why would you put a costume on? How would you fight crime? Would you just be a kind of an altruistic do-gooder, or would you have some other motive or some psychological flaw that made you do it?
Attention citizens, we are trying to maintain order. You must clear the streets until the police strike is over.
Superheroes are self-appointed authorities. These people are helping us most of the time, but what if someday they decide not to?
Our characters go out and again think they're doing really great things, but I think the comedian is a great example. When he's trying to control the riots, he ends up really beating up a lot of the people and then shooting them with rubber bullets. How far is too far?
How long till we keep this up?
Congress is pushing through some new bill that's going to outlaw masks. Our days are numbered. Till then, it's like you always say, we're society's only protection.
Their, morality and their beliefs driving their behavior and getting them to vigilante, I think started to create disdain amongst the people.
You want my rights! You are not the law! We want regular cops, no more vigilantes!
They're all fundamentalists in a way. They see a threatening world where their only recourse is to take matters into their own hands.
What do you suggest we do about it?
Retribution.
Watchmen are over.
Says Tricky Dick.
Says me.
They're actually slight failures, these characters. They were more heroic 10 years ago. They sat out with great ideals, and now they've kind of become compromised.
They didn't really have superpowers. They were just dudes wearing costumes. And it makes you think really, really hard about questions of ethics and morality in a way that we're sort of not used to, but Watchmen really forces us to.
They're criminals. They had intentions to commit crime. They should have realized there's a potential price to pay. They ran into the wrong guy at the wrong time.
If you think back, Bernard Goetz, the New York City vigilante, he really loomed large in the public consciousness. He was this enormously polarizing and to some really compelling figure.
It began on December 22nd, 1984, when 4 black youths approached the electronics expert on a subway and, according to Goetz, surrounded him and planned to rob him. He shot all 4 and escaped from the subway, but later surrendered to police.
When Bernard Goetz was the talk of the town 2 years ago, most of the talk proclaimed him hero. But now that the so-called subway gunman is on trial for attempted murder, it appears the tide of public opinion has turned against him.
Some people thought of him as a thug, an example of white rage gone amok. And some people thought of him as a private citizen who took justice into his own hands when the police wouldn't or couldn't do it.
Look at a case, and the precipitory factors to that case, and they say, look, this guy knew that by arming himself, he had the ability to take someone's life. He knew that by going into this situation, he was probably going to confront these individuals. He knew that when he used this verbiage, this wordage, when he caused these certain types of actions, he knew what was going to transpire. In other words, you're setting up the people. If you don't think that's going to come out in a court case, then you're sadly mistaken.
In English common law, there is a belief that before you use deadly force, you need to first show that you tried to retreat, that you had a duty to retreat. In American legal tradition, that doesn't really exist. And certainly as it's evolved into the 20th and 21st centuries, we've even gone further the other direction, where it is, we're to the point now where it's, if you feel like you're threatened, you can strike back with deadly force.
Jury apparently believed Getz as they found him innocent on all charges except the illegal possession of the .38 caliber revolver he used. Again and again he heard the words, "not guilty."
I think he did right. He himself admitted that he set out to kill them.
And there was something incredibly strange and just fascinating and repellent about him. Somebody who was thinking about right and wrong. He was thinking about his own ass as well, but he was thinking about right and wrong and acting on it outside the protective cloak of a badge or any kind of institutional sponsorship.
I don't think he's guilty.
Why not?
Because he didn't really do anything wrong.
Now, eventually, it's going to be open season on anybody.
You want to know about Rorschach? I'll tell you about Rorschach.
Rorschach, when he looks at the world, he sees everything in right or wrong. He does see himself as having this mission, sort of like Batman does, of eradicating evil, but Rorschach takes it a lot further. He assumes a lot more responsibility on his part. I mean, Batman catches criminals and then he gives them to the police. Okay, he doesn't torture them, he doesn't kill them. Rorschach, on the other hand, uses a lot more extreme means to get what he wants.
Edgar William Jacoby, also known as Edgar William Bond, also known as Moloch. What are you talking about? I'm a retired businessman.
He's looking to simplify this world into black and white. For him, that complexity makes no sense.
It's funny that he's probably the most beloved character within the Watchmen world. But at the same time, he's probably the most psychotic.
They have this romanticized version of Rorschach because he lives by his own code.
Because you want him to do harm to all those predators in society that you live vicariously through him. And you recognize he's going too far.
We're disgusted by his methods, but at the same time, if these are truly evil people he's doing it to, the little bit inside us that we may not want to recognize is going, yes.
You've watched this whole movie, you've watched, the bad guy do all these horrible things, and all you want to do is just see him dead. Like it's almost like you want to jump through the screen and kill him yourself.
Men get arrested. Dogs get put down.
Even in devoting his life to that, the police don't like him. Citizens don't like him. None of the Watchmen like him.
Good joke. Everybody laugh. Roll on snare drum. Curtains.
Through the 19th century, there are various examples you can find of vigilantism. Scholars will say that there is a noticeable uptick in violence after the Civil War. The Civil War teaches people that if you believe a certain thing, then you just use force to achieve it.
In the U.S., we typically have what we call the Trans-Mississippi West era, which most of us would refer to as the Old West.
In Missouri, literally the United States ends right there. They are so far on the edge of nowhere that there simply isn't any law enforcement.
We have now come into a modern era where you have laws throughout the United States. You have court systems throughout the United States.
There's an inherent distrust in the ability of the state, the government, what have you, to enforce the laws and to bring appropriate punishment where it's deserved.
Because what the vigilantes got, which they haven't got, is raw power. The power to deal out justice instantly.
Let me use the Bald Knobbers example. They were concerned that the government in the county was corrupt. And so they actually were attacking supporters of the government. At one point they said that this is a battle between barbarism and civilization. I would say in a vigilante situation, you have to have this kind of us versus them mentality. You have to be able to say, those people, okay, or the other. There has to be a distance of some kind.
There's a long history of vigilantism that is not well received by many because there's racial implications. Are you a homophobe? Are you a sadist? Why do you want to be cast in that light?
We were all attempting through our personal efforts to make our country a better and a safer place to live.
Clearly, Hollis Mason is a man who makes no apologies for the life he's lived or the decisions he's made. But is his own personal moral code enough justification for donning a mask and dispensing vigilante justice?
My primary mission in life is to protect the innocent and defenseless. And especially at this time in this world, with all the evil going on, all the wars going on, all the crime going on, that's why there's superheroes popping up everywhere. We're standing up for what we believe in.
The city is now a cesspool of vileness and needs expunged. There's so many people that turn a blind eye to what goes on around them. It makes me sick. And that's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Well, every kid, even in the worst of circumstances, even in a completely dysfunctional family, would like to be a superhero. But boy, that idealism, that degree of hero worship that overtakes you when you're so young can be knocked the hell out of you.
I was beaten a lot as a kid, and that motivated me to want to protect other people from living through that kind of stuff. I realized I could do a lot of good in this world protecting people, and that helped me understand my calling in life.
I was influenced heavily by my grandfather. He unfortunately was murdered out in front of his own house, and that's what really gave me the wake-up call to do what I'm doing today. So I've taken my personal vendetta, my revenge, my spite, my hate, my fueled anger, and I've bottled it into pure light.
I can understand the emotional and visceral satisfaction that one might get out of that. I understand that, but there are a number of different things that people have to be aware of. One, if it's a matter of going out and preventing crime, that's great. If it's a matter of being good witnesses, that's great. You can find yourself in a vigilante atmosphere getting in over your head, finding yourself in a situation that maybe at the outset you thought was one way, but upon further and complete investigation could be diametrically opposed to what you initially perceived it to be in the first place.
It depends on the situation. If I see someone being attacked, I'm going to take that person, I'm going to throw them off them like I've done before, and I'm going to kick their ass, tell the other person to get away and call the cops. It's time to take action. That's what we need to do. The police can't be everywhere.
We step above that letter of the law. We don't have all that red tape that they have to go through. We're not bound by guidelines and rules like they are.
I mean, we do have a tradition of citizen arrest. You know, we do have neighborhoods that organize patrols and neighborhood watches. And these individuals are just taking it a little further, and they're doing it usually by themselves instead of an organized community effort.
I have never seen a costumed vigilante, although I understand that they do exist. All I can say about them is if those people were inspired in some way by Watchmen, I don't know if they really understood it. Possibly they didn't get to the end.
Some people have a very romantic notion of swooping in to save the damsel in distress, so to speak, and you can find yourself losing everything as a result. So I can come across a person, and I think that I'm going to be the hero because I'm dressed up in a cape and everything else. Well, I got a guy here that just got out of the joint. He's got a joint build, knows what he's doing, and he doesn't care, and the next thing you know, you're dead.
Even with the very best of intentions, you could find yourself in some situations where you might be causing more problems than you were solving.
If I die in this line of work, I can actually die thinking that I've completed something.
There's a romanticism to vigilanteism in Hollywood, but there is absolutely nothing romantic about an autopsy.
When I hear about people doing this, I think, you know, that's actually a good thing to an extent.
So what you're looking at here is just some of the equipment. This is by no means all of it that we not only train individuals in, that we have to learn how to operate. It kind of gives you a visual of what it takes in order to confront actual suspects out there that might be armed. You go in and you confront somebody and you think you have the situation under control, and suddenly, because suspects act in a very extemporaneous fashion, they can suddenly go from literally 0 to 60 in a fraction of a second, and you have to respond accordingly. But there are also bounds that you have to operate within. And unless you're a trained professional, most people don't know what those bounds are.
It would take a superhero to stay morally staunch as a vigilante, and I've never met one.
Certainly we've had instances of police officers going too far, but they're investigated and they're disciplined if appropriate. No one's saying the system is perfect, but there are internal affairs departments that police do police themselves.
I mean, you sort of hope if you're a cop that all the cops out there are doing the same thing, fighting the same battles, with the same sense of morality, the same code, and that's just not the way it happens. I guess you're part of a big fraternal order of police, but there's extortion, and there are good cops, and there are bad cops.
I gotta tell you, the temptations out there, particularly once you've established your credibility, are being thrown at you fast and furiously. It's like you're a rock star. It's like you're a rap star. And then you need to control your humongous ego because you need a crane to get it in and out of the room. And then that's when you decide to do things that you know are morally wrong and legally wrong. I must be right. I'm a guardian. I'm the one that people are depending on. And then that's when you begin to take advantage of it.
I'm anonymous for the times that I don't stay within the law. No one wants to be corrupt. No one wants to admit that corruption is rampant, but it is. There's a monster in everyone.
My allegiance is not to the law. My allegiance is to what is morally right.
I would contend vigilantism seldom turns out well. The moment at which you take a large step and a frequent step outside the legal, the normal legal realm, it's not long before, you've joined the criminals yourself. So, and you begin to do things and see yourself as bigger and above the law.
And that's what I've found with all vigilantes. They occupy a really dark and terrifying place.
What is it that someone does that makes them a hero? And are those things always as cut and dry and easy as they are in the movies?
There probably are people out there in the community who do heroic things, but who don't dress up, who don't announce themselves. I think that would probably be my definition of a real-life superhero.
It's not one person's responsibility. No one person should have the authority to do that, and that's who Watches the Watchmen comes from, is if we have these self-appointed vigilantes going out and not just catching criminals, but they are appointing themselves as judge, jury, and executioner, or punisher, and that's who Watches the Watchmen. If we appoint guardians or self-appointed guardians, who's going to guard them? Who's going to watch them?
When you have somebody who, and whether it's a vigilante, a superhero, or anybody who exercises power over another person, our natural assumption as sheep-like human beings is that person must be right. If they're exercising authority, they must be entitled to it. But the reality is there is no ground. There's just it's kind of an infinite regress of moral ambiguity. And the answer is nobody watches the Watchmen.
It was actually while I was reading the novel that I got the call that I had gotten the project and knew that I had to do it.
Having read the graphic novel several times now, huge fan of it.
It is the Citizen Kane of graphic novels.
Like, it changed my entire life. Like, after reading that, I wanted to be a comic artist. It's the one graphic novel I tell people that don't read comics to read.
You knew right away you were in the presence not only of a masterpiece, but of a new kind of masterpiece.
It was the first book to change everything you knew about comics.
It's about the underbelly of the superhero, or the other side of the superhero, the unmasked superhero, which is what, to me, is the most exciting thing about it.
To subvert your notion of what the whole superhero story is about, and kind of question why we have created these archetypes for ourselves in modern times, to crush this enterprise and maybe out of those ashes create something new and more interesting.
It was just a magnitude of different thinking and approach and conceptualization. There was something about this book that broke all the rules, but it worked. The trade paperback has continued to be one of the best selling trade paperbacks in our entire industry. The phenomenon as such carried so far that every day we sell more.
Watchmen was so groundbreaking that it caused, I was going to say, ripples of excitement throughout DC and the comic book industry, you know, of retailers and readers, but really it caused a tsunami.
It was instantly viewed as a classic, as a work of literature that was beyond its own genre.
It's won so many different unique awards. I was the first to win a Nebula Science Fiction Award.
It was the only graphic novel to win a Hugo Award. It was the only graphic novel to be on Time Magazine's top 100 English language novels of the 20th century.
You can't get away from the fact that by any imaginable aesthetic standard, Watchmen is a masterpiece. The things it talks about are universal. It understands itself as a medium, and most importantly, it reads with precisely the same devastating effect today as it did when it was first released.
We were really trying to change the face of comic books. When I came in the 70s, comics really were still considered an ephemeral medium for kids. But we really felt very strongly that the medium allowed for the most sophisticated stories, the most offbeat stories, the most independent stories. Paul Levitt said, you know, there's some great talent and great work coming out of England. And so I actually went over and had a dinner to meet and greet as many artists and writers and colorists as I could. And Alan was really one of the great lights in the comic book industry.
When you get uniquely talented people who kind of all come together at a certain point in their career, sometimes magic happens and it lasts. Gibbons and Moore were, you know, known talents, but they weren't superstars. And all of a sudden you've taken the brakes off, you said, hey, what would you do with this idea? And then you get something like Watchmen.
When Watchmen was first mooted, it was actually going to be a story about the characters that were owned by a comics publishing company called Charlton Comics.
We thought that we would try to put Alan and the masterful artist Dave Gibbons together with the Charlton characters to try to reinvent them.
And what we realised was these superhero characters were actually archetypes. They were what you needed for a line of hero comics. There was the kind of masked character who had wonderful gadgets to fight crime with. There was the person with supernatural powers, you know, the masked vigilante type, and the femme fatale superheroine. And when we talked about ideas and what these characters could be like, there was one that wasn't pinned down. And I said to Alan, I said, oh, you know, I came up with this character when I was 14 and making up my own character. It's called Night Owl. And Alan went, yeah, that's quite good. And I said, but it's spelt Niteowl, the American way. He went, oh, yeah, that would be perfect. So Night Owl became Watchmen. And actually, the design of the Golden Age Night Owl, the older Night Owl, Hollis Mason Night Owl, is exactly the costume that I drew on my character when I was 14. I don't know quite why I wanted him to have that particular outfit, and it was kind of a little bit like kind of Robin, Batman's Robin, with the shorts and the short sleeves on here and the domino mask and everything. And I actually unearthed the other day the drawing I did when I was 14, and you can see just how long some ideas do take to come to fruition.
The Charlton characters were the inspiration originally, but Watchmen became a thing of its own.
When you talk about where Alan Moore was and where Dave Gibbons was in their career, they had worked together previously, they knew each other well, and all of a sudden to sort of be kind of given a blank piece of paper and said, go do it.
Getting the Watchmen scripts they were essentially 22 pages of comic story. The scripts could sometimes be 135 pages long for a 22-page comic, which is unheard of. Usually a 22-page comic script would be 22 pages. Every panel was meticulous in its descriptions. A description of the room, what was on the desk, how the light was coming in through the window, what color the curtains were. Every single aspect, as if he was describing a photograph.
These two people coming together were very much Lennon and McCartney, an additive experience. They were so in tune with each other. They'd sit on a couch together side by side and draw on the same piece of paper about what they were thinking.
Watchmen was a collaborative effort, and Alan had a lot of things nailed down. Okay, this is the story, and these are the political kind of implications. And I was kind of interested in what the day-to-day feeling of society would be. You know, things like fast foods, things like fashion, things like reading material.
What would cars look like at that time? How did the costumes work? And Alan would think deeper about how did the themes work into what Dave is giving me. Like Dave put the smiley face button on the comedian because he looked so grim and so nasty, which Alan then looked at and of course ran with, making it the first issue cover and a keystone of the whole concept, really. The happy smile with the blood drop on it. It was one of those things that really grabbed you as a very visceral, iconic image. And then John Higgins, who was the colorist and a friend of Dave's, he just literally lived a few miles away. So Dave would meet with him.
The script went to Dave. Dave analysed that, broke it down, did the storytelling from that, and then we talked.
Colorists often get left out when one's talking about a great work because so much is about the writing and the art, but the art in black and white doesn't compare to the fully colored art. And John Higgins gave real dimensionality to the ideas and the forms of Alan and Dave.
You could color it standard. Why wouldn't you color it standard? No, that wasn't enough. That wasn't good enough. Let's try something different.
In a colour sense, probably my first trip to New York in '84 probably did sit in the back of my brain because it really was a sense of sort of the neon pinks and the garish greens and reflections.
John came back with what many consider an outlandish palette, or an ugly palette even, but it worked. They clearly disposed of all the traditional approaches. So when Dave submitted the concept for, say, a logo that runs up the side of the cover, well, that doesn't sound like radical now, but back then it was, how would you know what the book was? And then to top it off, how would you have an illustration on the front cover that wasn't an action shot? There's not an action shot in any of those 12 original covers. That cover image is actually the first panel of the book.
It comes down to things that are absolutely invisible to the reader unless you deconstruct it. The kind of work that Dave did with setting up the 9 grid as his primary storytelling tool, how he violated it, how he stuck with it.
So we could do an issue of a comic that was symmetrical, and that had a kind of an aesthetic thrill. It wasn't necessarily important to the story that it was symmetrical, but it was to the theme of it, and it was going in a slightly different direction. Techniques that had been worked out by previous masters like Will Eisner, where you could, say, hold the camera's point of view and have characters walk past it, or follow the character through a scene across a changing background, where you could echo panel compositions, So I think what we were really kind of celebrating with Watchmen was what you could do with a comic book.
A monthly book of that quality is just unheard of.
As the pages came in, I think we were out of our minds. I don't think we were prepared for the layers, the density, the subtlety, the nuance. It was breathtaking.
There's almost nothing non-cliche you can say about your first reading of Watchmen, because it is always, and incredible revelation.
A piece of literature that is at once incredibly ambitious, yet speaks to the reader on the most personal terms. At the time, I remember it really blew my mind.
It's stunning. You just see things that you can never unsee.
These guys were given the first go-ahead to say, it's okay to do a story that doesn't follow the conventions, and it's okay to do a story for older people, to do that which has not been done before. And the guys stepped in and they rewrote the rule book for purposes of that discussion.
Wow, they're really saying interesting things about ethics, they're saying interesting things about politics, they're saying interesting things about the nature of time and the nature of reality and metaphysics. And The Watchmen was the first book to introduce this aspect to comics.
I think what struck me most when I read it was as much the art as the words. The use of visual motifs, techniques that I thought were unique to film, the idea of repeating shapes, looping images.
The book reached me the way no other comic book ever had before.
Y tus trailers, visita mi canal.
One of the amazing things about Watchmen was that it woke up comics and really stared hard at them and made them look at themselves.
Really, Watchmen was a postmodern comic book. It's so self-referential to all the things that we know about comic books and superheroes.
It takes a look at itself, but it also gives you what it's about and examines that.
It really dismantles and really looks at that genre and turns it on its ear.
Nobody knows who you are. You can give it up. Try and have a normal life. Is that what you have now? A normal life. You really feel normal. At least I'm not the one still hiding behind a mask.
It wasn't until Watchmen came along that we really understood what a realistic treatment of the psychology of a superhero would be.
There's a tremendous exploration in Watchmen of why people actually would put on costumes and go out adventuring.
It tries to subvert the idea of what someone who was actually attempting to be heroic is like.
It's actually rather hard to imagine a genuine, grounded person doing that, and what would motivate a person to do that. And it explores that in so many ways, and the answers are not necessarily savory about why someone would do that.
It goes through all the variations of why would you put a costume on? Why would you want to fight crime? Would you be, slightly mad? Would you be altruistic? What would happen if you got superpowers and you couldn't care less, which is kind of Dr. Manhattan,
Your privacy and your ability to have a normal relationship, your ability to have a normal job, all the things that we take for granted, they sacrifice that for justice or something like that. And what does that do to you? Does that make you crazy? Does it make you a recluse? Does it make you lose touch with humanity? These are all the questions that Watchmen asks.
And the notion of the loss of innocence is a big theme in the novel. It's not by accident that they're middle-aged.
In a lot of cases that they're actually slight failures, these characters. They were more heroic 10 years ago. They sat out with great ideals and now they've kind of become compromised.
Being a superhero wasn't necessarily so super.
He became angry, psychotic, impotent, self-doubting in ways he never had been before. They tore down the idea of the hero, and the funny thing is, when they were done, the hero seemed realer than ever, and we sort of loved them even more.
Visita mi canal.
How does one be heroic in a very complicated world?
We can save this world.
It's 1985, it's post-Vietnam. It is the point in American history that is post-idealism, where as a culture, as a country, as a world, we're no longer capable of looking at things in black and white.
And I think maybe that's why people like Rorschach so much, because he lives by his own code, and it's very black and white. There's good and there's evil, and evil must be punished. And I think the notion as an audience is that that's pretty good. Yeah.
He wants to see the world as an orderly place, and he's determined to do that, fatally so. And I think we all want to do that, and we all fail continuously. He sort of stands for this longing we all have to see things in terms of good and evil. And of course, that's how earlier superheroes always behaved, more or less, where they knew what was good and what was bad, and who was a hero and who was a villain. Rorschach thinks he does, which is why he's so completely tortured, because the real world, which is what I think we encounter in Watchmen, presents everybody with choices that are just impossible choices. Choices where good and evil can't be untangled.
What is a good guy? Who are the good guys? What does that even mean?
This is all bullshit. The comedian kind of gets it. You know, he's like, none of this really matters, man. We're all doing this because we have to, but it's not like we're helping.
I can never tell when you're joking.
Watchmen. That's the real joke. We can't sit at home, but we're not really going to improve the world. The world is an enormous place. You know, for most people, it's entertainment. And I suppose to some extent they must accept that because they dress up in costumes.
Ultimately, he wants to do good, and he wants to, I think, have friends, have relationships. I think he's just clumsy at it. He doesn't have people skills at all. Absolutely a bull in a china shop.
Watchmen doesn't try to answer the question of who's right and who's wrong. It lets the reader decide.
Unable to unite the world by conquest, Alexander's method, I would trick it, frighten it towards salvation with history's greatest practical joke. That's what upset the comedian when awareness of my scheme crashed in upon him. Professional jealousy. Blake's murder. You confess? Confession implies penitence. I merely regret his accidental involvement.
These masked vigilantes, are they doing the right thing? Are they just as bad as the villains that they're trying to catch?
Just because I'm wearing that doesn't mean I can.
I think that we all think, oh, wouldn't it be great for someone to take matters into their own hands, or, you know what, the court system takes too long and too many people get off, and really, like, someone should just go in there and crime bust.
But at the same time, the more rational part of us is saying that it's not one person's responsibility. No one person should have the authority to do that.
Who decides whose morality is correct, you know?
Who are these assholes to say when doomsday approaches? I say when doomsday is approaching.
Abuse of power is a strong theme throughout Watchmen. Not just actually the superheroes, but I think it's even bigger than that, where we have a President Nixon at the time, because the superhero is American and basically the government controls him, he actually takes those powers and uses Dr. Manhattan to change term limits. So he gives himself more power.
The sense of power and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you have to do something about it and limit it.
Killing millions. To save billions. A necessary crime.
You know, we can't let you do that.
Do that, Rorschach? I'm not a comic book villain.
In regular superhero comics, there's all these characters with all these powers, yet the world that they live in is just the world that we live in. You know, the fact that there is a man with godlike powers walking around seems to have made no difference to people's everyday lives, and that seems very unlikely. I suddenly realised one day, this isn't a superhero story. This is actually a science fiction story. This is an alternate history. This is, what if somebody had the powers of a god? What would the world be like?
We repeat, the Superman exists, and he is American.
Once I thought about it like that, I didn't even draw it as if it was a superhero story. I didn't want to draw it that way. I wanted to draw it as if it was an alternate history. In which case, all the background things, all the buildings, the forms of transport, the fashions, the fads, immediately become what the story's about.
If those characters had existed in a world where there were superheroes and regular people, how would that change the course of that world's history?
What does it do to religion? What does it do to politics? What does it do to just society having the super being live among us?
Now, if you begin to feel an intense and crushing feeling of religious terror at the concept, don't be alarmed. That indicates only that you are still sane.
It put the ideas of costume adventurism, superheroes, and comic books within a reality which I actually lived in, dealing with New York City, dealing with a political climate that I could relate to.
Those were the years of Ronald Reagan here in America, of Margaret Thatcher in England, and a lot of right-wing conservative politics.
The threat is relatable. The idea that two massive countries would stockpile weapons and could have them pointed at one another with nothing but a push of a button between total annihilation. Those ideas loom larger than almost anything fictitious a writer could make up.
Take us to DEFCON 1.
Great sci-fi is able to deconstruct our world. You know, it holds up a mirror to us. You know, you see in that world the relevant messages of our own.
Breathtaking. John, what about the war? You've got to prevent it. Everyone will die. And the universe will not even notice.
You see, it's a world like ours, but not like ours. And that concept of heroes as though they were real in the real world has become a very common theme in comics. Many people have played with it since then.
Tráilers. Visita mi canal.
I'm sure that Alan had discovered the quote about Einstein saying that he wished he had been a watchmaker, and thought, well, that's the perfect occupation for John's father. And of course, then when you see the whole thing about Watchmen, when you also realise that it is about time, it's watches, you know, watch in the sense of a timepiece. So the theme of the whole book is about time and about the passage of time. And when we get to the episode that deals with Dr. Manhattan, with John Osterman, it's all about hopping backwards and forwards in time and seeing time as just a continuum which always exists.
Making time fluid was just was such a natural way of telling the story of the Watchmen. They become fully dimensional characters because you actually knew their history, and the history was the flashback, and the flashbacks like crossed over with like the flash forward, and then it's like, you know, they were just like parallel scenes running on Mars and then in Manhattan. So you can flick back, it's like check that scene, it's like, you know, go forward again. And yeah, it is quite conceptually different to anything else that had certainly been written at that particular time.
The fact that the story moves backwards and forwards in time does give the characters a richness, and you don't have to say very much to give a great deal of depth, and that's what Alan did so expertly.
The structure of Watchmen is something that I don't think anybody is ever going to fully unravel. I've talked to Dave Gibbons about it, and even he looks at this thing that he made and is baffled by its complexity. All these little things that connect together, the tiniest little scraps of lines and details and throwaway words. What they loved about comic books is that you can page backwards and forwards in them at will. The richness, you can always go back and delve down to a deeper level. I think that's partly what Dr. Manhattan's about. He experiences time backwards and forwards. He moves through it more or less at will. And that's what the reader is when you read a comic book.
If only you could perceive time as I do.
With Watchmen, each time you do it, it means something slightly different.
It was extraordinarily thought out and executed and set a standard on those levels that perhaps hasn't been equaled.
That was nice. Like that one.
The Watchmen movie has been a thing that's been mooted for many, many years, kind of 20 years, I guess, at least, and it's been through, I don't know how many directors, producers, studios and things. But I think actually that has been a good thing, because just as when it came along in the world of comics and kind of deconstructed the things that everybody was familiar with, I think now the general movie-going public is very familiar with the kind of idea of comic book heroes and the conventions of the field, you know, and the kind of classic themes. And I think that now in the movies it can be taken to pieces and people will understand actually what the thing that's being deconstructed means.
Bring up the rain! Bring up the rain.
There's some parallels with this book that was written 20-some odd years ago that ring it really true today and where we are now as a society and as the world.
We live in the Watchmen world, even maybe more so than 1985.
The energy crisis or abuse of power, you know, in the presidency.
Watchmen itself was sui generis, and people look to it then and look to it now as something that really heralds all the possibilities of creating a work of art in comic book pages.
I've always been interested in things that are heightened and that can give us a perspective that can reflect back something very real. In truth, we are exaggerated. Whether it is heightened and there's a blue man and there are superheroes and there are, you know, masked crime fighters in the 1940s and all of those things, they are still issues that we can all relate to, about people trying to find themselves and find their place in society and find the way to change the world, and how is that possible? And those are sort of endless questions. Those are questions you can continuously ask yourself.
There are two generations of mass vigilantes and Watchmen. There's the early generation, which is, you know, they're known as Minutemen, which is Old Night Owl, which is Hollis Mason, and Captain Metropolis. Silk Spectre, the first one, Sally Jupiter. Silhouette, Hooded Justice, Mothman, Dollar Bill, and the Comedian.
This Fung movie spans such an interesting length of time. It's such an interesting deconstruction of the superhero, really looking at it from a different reality, almost, you know, from the point of what would a world be like if people dressed up in costumes and got into the vigilante business.
Hooded Justice was the first mass vigilante. He started dressing up because that's what, you know, the bank robbers were doing and all the criminals of the time. And he said, well, why don't we do the same thing? Why don't we dress up? The cops can't get it done. You know, let's take matters into our own hands.
You know, you may think you put on a mask to do good things, and but you find that you're kind of on the outside, and you have a power, and you start acting like what you hate.
What was interesting about that time is that you could invent yourself.
And that's what they did, and that's when this group of Minutemen kind of came around, and then they organized.
Now, the comedian, starting from a young age, I think he was looking for a surrogate family.
I think they were all renegades and rebels and didn't really fit in and felt that the world, they had to go out and get their own, and she wasn't going to be a housewife, which at that time was what people expected you to be.
You know, imagining the back history of Watchmen was a lot of fun, and also it was a lot of fun because you only had to glimpse it. You didn't have to draw whole continuities that took place in the 1930s. The design of the Golden Age Night Owl, the older Night Owl, Hollis Mason Night Owl, is exactly the costume that I drew on my character when I was 14.
Coming up with the designs for the early superheroes was lots of fun. We wanted to be as accurate to the graphic novel as we could possibly be. All these fantastically antiquated and wonderful costuming techniques that you usually try and stay far away from because this is the 21st century. It was great to really embrace all of these costuming aesthetic and go to town with it. We had fun putting together Captain and Metropolis and Hooded Justice, who actually turned out to be two of my favorite costumes in the movie. I was really happy with how they turned out.
In the graphic novel, there's a shot, sort of a group photo of the Minutemen, the original Minutemen. It plays very heavily in the movie. You know, Sally has that picture, Blake has that picture, and also Hollis also has the picture. We really wanted to recreate that photo for the movie.
To sit here and have all these characters together, which only happens once in the movie, is really sort of satisfying, intimidating, exciting, awesome, you know, use your expletive. It's ultimately, though, an honor to be the stills photographer who makes that photograph.
1, 2, 3.
This film's an incredibly exciting film to work on. The process is great. We have an enormous amount to build. There are so many different locations and environments in the story. Big advantage has been that we've been able to build a great deal and really make the film look like the graphic novel.
During the riot, the inmates are now out of their cages. They're running the asylum. Dan and Laurie, in their outfits, land here, and they see that, and they start coming like this.
When we came through first, none of this was here. Really, the only thing that was here was this hole in the roof above. When I was walking through here, it struck me that really that look is all to do with that split level. You know, that double, triple, quadruple level that you get in a jail. The narrowness really helped us. There's enough existing location here that we were able to add bars, add a couple of walls, but generally we've contained this in a very kind of tight little set. And then the real significant one is Karnak. This is a set that on the exterior in its entirety is largely a digital model, but it contains a very large set in the middle of it. And then in that set, much like his office, we have this very modern architecture for the 80s mixed with this kind of museum-like space for antiquities and giant sculptures. But it's a very polished space and a quite difficult thing to build because it's got sloping walls that had to be very, very light, but look very, very heavy. Well, we're in New York, 1985. This is really the hub of Watchmen world. We've got this tiny little space that we've carved out of New York in that period, 1985. It sort of centers around 43rd Street and 6th Avenue. And it just made sense, you know, as we started to build New York City, that we realized, well, these guys are going to be walking down these streets and blah, blah, blah. You might as well just build this whole thing. I mean, we ended up having 200 sets in the movie. It's a lot of sets. We did a bunch that looks like Mothman in, like, you know, the 1950s. And we did the Baby Rorschach, you know, and then we did 77 over here. And then this was all 85, and I think they all have their own distinct sort of thing happening. It's really important for us to establish a world that is real to an audience, even though it's got the Watchmen overtones of color and palette, and it absolutely remains faithful to the vision of the graphic novel. Building by building, you go through and you build a layer, let it sit, let it age, let the rain hit it for a little while, then come back and do another layer. Everyone on my crew, the painters, the artists, the graphic designers, the prop masters, they're all taken a huge amount of time studying the graphic novel. It's helped enormously to add texture to this kind of Watchmen world, so it's definitely a kind of mix of looking at real location reference from the time and then adding in this layer that the graphic novel frames help to kind of cement into this very specific Watchmen kind of bubble.
So we've cut it underneath, but it's like...
Michael Wilkinson is the costume designer for Watchmen. You know, he's super talented, and I really respect him a lot. And he had his work cut out for him on this because I believe that aesthetically audiences have moved pretty far down the road toward what a superhero costume looks like.
There's a pretty mammoth task getting it all together because we had to cover different decades from the 20th century. The film starts in 1938 and goes forward to 1985. So for each decade we had to try and get some iconic looks from each period that really sort of summed up the period so the audience would get a very clear idea as we jump cut back and forward throughout the decades exactly where we were in the 20th century. So when you think about someone like Sally Jupiter, we see her all the way back in 1938, and then she has, I think, 8 or 9 different costumes as we go through the different decades. So we built a lot of things for Cada. We sourced some vintage pieces, we mixed them together to create our character, which was a lot of fun. In gathering together the costume stock for the film, we really tried to take our starting point from the graphic novel. We wanted to be very respectful to the source material. So it affected a lot of our choice of colors. We really tried to keep within the greens, the purples, the murky sort of secondary colors that are in the graphic novel. But we also tried to really give a real sense of period authenticity to the movie because it was important for us that we wanted to represent the 20th century as it was if there had really been superheroes.
And we really needed to be faithful to the original designs and time period, but I think we needed to address what my parents or my neighbors knew about superheroes and what they expected and sort of that iconology of what a superhero is. Michael really arrived at costumes that kind of were able to do both.
In designing the superheroes for this film, they had to have a sense of humanity and unusually sort of detailed texture to them. We didn't want them to feel like they were all airbrushed and from another universe. They were very much real too. So when you see the street clothes next to the superheroes, you can see that there's a link of humanity between them. That applies to all of the costumes really for the film. We really wanted to have a real lived-in, gritty feel to it to convey the sense of the late 20th century being in this very paranoid, desperate sort of position on the brink of like nuclear disaster. So that's what we tried to convey in the costumes.
I think the Owlship is one of those cool Batmobile type vehicles, abstract shape that looks kind of like an egg and an owl mixed together. My team of designers have taken that shape and just made it pretty cool.
From just the genre point of view, they needed to have a guy who had to ship. A guy in a suit, he's got gadgets, he's got his vehicle. And that's Dan.
If the illustrator, David Gibbons, was drawing the Owlship, we have taken that idea and just gone all the way with it, to take a sort of iconographic shape and make it like into a real object that like lives in the world, and that's awesome fun.
You could kind of go either way when you look at the graphic novel, a very slick kind of sci-fi craft or something that really you could believe would fly and doesn't always fly very well and has been through some scrapes.
This is the chipboard Owlship. Yes. Because it's wood, see? This is the actual ship. This is how big it is. This is where they drive it from. But this is how big it is inside. That tape actually is where we're going to cut it off so you can shoot.
Once they had the design fixed, they did a 3D computer model of it. The ribs are steel, the floor's aluminum. There's a steel framework underneath this that's quite structural. It was built exactly like a one-off boat. We stood up frames and we double planked it with mahogany plywood and then fiberglass inside and out. We could have made it float. We've cut holes in it for lights and hatches, and the walls come out for camera access. But this could have been a structural boat.
We decided that we would find the right scale and build it as an interior-exterior piece. But a lot of the time it's there hanging from a crane or on a motion base or in a real relationship with the actors. And it's proving to be one of the real great components of the film.
So the big challenge was to give them a full structural unit that could do everything they wanted. And that was
That was kind of challenging, and have it light as possible.
We didn't get the owl ship until 2 weeks before it flew. So we had to engineer everything and design everything to an assumed weight.
The owl ship weighs just under 11,000 pounds as it sits, and it's pretty much at the top end of what this particular unit will do. And this is a Waldo, which geometrically is the same as the big gimbal over there. So the moves that we create here are basically repeated over underneath the owl ship.
The trickiest section was flying outside the tenement because we only had about 3 inches of clearance. When the eyes were facing the window, we literally had 3 inches, and that was all on a motion base. And if we had something had gone wrong, we would have had a little bit of a problem.
When I walked in it the first time, I was just blown away. Every time I sort of get in there, I sort of need somebody to come over and like, all right, help me out. So I'm just not look like I'm pushing buttons here. Okay, what do we have here? You know, so I needed to sort of go through that with the designers and what works, what doesn't work, what can I hit.
I'll this down, and I'll be full with this.
Yeah, because then when we go to Antarctica, you're trying thrust like this. Those
Yeah.
would be thrust. Right?
I think so, right? It's
Yeah.
weird. In the Millennium Falcon, don't they push it forward?
Yeah, they do. But that's fine. They're.
You want to do
that's
a nod
fake.
to that? Or you
Galaxy far, far away. That's fake.
I don't know.
We're doing this is real, so it's different.
It just hit the nail on the head when Dave Gibbons came and visited set, and he was out of control, filled with emotion of how real it was, how true it was to the novel and his drawings.
The fact that Zack Snyder is making it, you know, a guy who clearly loves comics and is very familiar with it and realises the importance of sticking to the original themes. I mean, just amazing stuff. He's stuck as closely as he can to what we put in the original comic book and played the strengths of that rather than just taking a bunch of characters and making a generic movie. It's been quite a while since we actually did Watchmen, and even today, looking around the set, I've seen things that I'd forgotten about, where people go, oh, you remember this is the bit where, oh yeah, that's right, yeah, I remember it very clearly now. I mean, I was wandering around and I looked at the set dressing, the things that are there in the background and probably won't even be noticed. Been incredible amount of care put into those. So it's an amazing thing to see an actual newspaper printed on newsprint that says, you know, some headline about Dr. Manhattan or you know, masked crime busters or something.
Imagine him as a young guy drawing this stuff, and flash forward 25 years later, and he gets to see someone with incredible artistry in 3 dimensions rebuild that and craft that full scale.
You know, when you draw something from your imagination, you have a model in your head that you draw from and you try and interpret in a kind of a misty kind of impression of a picture. This is like seeing that picture crystallised into reality. The actors seem to be really, really into it. And actually, a few of them were telling me when they're kind of stuck for how they're going to play something, they'll open the graphic novel and have a look at it and think, oh yeah, that's right, yeah, that's how I've got to move. That's how the dialogue's delivered.
Well, part of you becomes vested in your character. So there's this little piece of me that feels like I'm, you know, meeting, you know, one of my parents, you know, one of the creators. And I can't tell you, you know, it was really important that, you know, Dad really liked what was going on here.
And it's just fantastic for somebody who lives in their imagination a lot of the time to see on the set how the colours that we used in Watchmen had been translated to the big screen. The palette that we went for was not the usual comic book palette. The usual comic book palette is blue, red, yellow, the primary colours. And what we went for was the secondary colours, you know, the purples, the greens, the oranges. And I think that, you know, made Watchmen distinctive. And I think the fact that that's been carried through to the movie version, that it doesn't look like just another comic book movie. It's another one of these pinch me moments, like, am I really looking at this? You know, it is like a fully realised, crystallised dream. I've got a feeling with the movie that, you know, experts in their field have been used in so many of the things, and just the level of detail and texture in that's going to have people running it over and over again on their DVD machines. And to actually literally live in your imagination, to actually see these things become solid in the world, it's just incredibly exciting. Probably one of the most exciting experiences I've had connected with comics.
It's been a long time, Rorschach.
We are at the prison set, and right now we're set up for a high fall coming over the second level, as well as we're setting up for a fire burn in the same shot. This is just as the riot begins in the show.
Prison inmates are going to be beating up some other guards, throwing another guard over top of the railing before I go, and we have to synchronize the timing for that before I actually go out and get lit up, because we have to make sure that the fuelant is only on my body for a certain amount of time, otherwise it starts to dilute, and then it won't go up as quick. So
Fire jail has been around for forever, and there's some guys who have developed a combination of their own gel and fuel combination. But this is interesting because you can do it on bare skin, so it adds another element.
It became a two-stage process. The gel is the protective barrier. It looks clear. It looks like it's not even there almost, depending on how tight the shot is, obviously. And then we pour fuel on it and light it up.
Tráilers, visita mi canal.
It's really just a normal weekend activity for Doug. It has nothing to do with the burn.
Start some crash day in prison.
it's not a good week unless you burn at least a couple times.
There's a paramedic. Be standing right here in the event that he needs any kind of attention. Thank you. Stand by, guys. Here we go. Stand by. Are you ready? Take 1-8 camera tail.
Zach's vision for the film is getting at the realism as much as possible. You can see from the color palette, there's a lot of purples and yellows and greens, much like Dave has drawn in the book. I call it like stylized realism.
With Watchmen, not through the treatment of the film where we're trying to emulate the look of the book, but the use of the secondary palette, and it's a little more subconscious, but the influence is definitely there.
Zach's storyboards, I mean, we know everything what we're doing. It's so helpful because you roughly know your angles and where to put your lights and stuff like that, yeah.
I wouldn't say necessarily there's a one lighting style that can say you're in this era or not, but it jumps back and forth. Some things look very modern and maybe you wouldn't have seen in a film in the 80s, but other parts, you know, the film, I think, completely feel like you're being transported.
Though we're in a hell ship, we have a love scene in there, you know, with just moonlight, and then we have snow and lights on, and obviously you can't put lights everywhere. You have to cheat, and it's very difficult when you're in a small area like that, you know. It's like shooting in a shoebox.
Zach's approach has been a very traditional way of shooting and a traditional way of composition. And the best way to do that was sometimes with a single camera.
Back off, or I'll stick this glass in.
When you make a movie, a lot of times you take a second camera, and if the actors are talking, you stick a second camera in there to try and get a close-up or something like that to make it move along faster. That second camera normally suffers a little bit in its composition and design just because it's not the primary focus. But for this movie, it's a one-camera show.
His shots are so designed, so it's hard to kind of get a B camera just somewhere to get another shot, and, you know, he won't use it. When you're doing 180-degree dolly moves and stuff, I mean, where do you put the other camera? You know, it's great for me because that means I can make each shot the way I want it to without compromising, which you usually do when you have 2, 3, 4 cameras.
The shots are there and they sit and the action plays out.
I think we always knew Watchmen would be this way, more practical. I think even at 300, you know, all the green screen was more about skies and distant background. I think a lot of the visual interest isn't just in sprinkling magic post-production look on it, but just the design of the shots and the sets and the lighting. And it's a dark movie, so you see some of these sets and, you know, they're lit really dark. There's that edge where you're keeping the sets really dark, but you still want to show off how amazing they are.
And action!
If you go on the streets of New York, which I've done, you end up turn off all the street lights that are making multiple shadows and you put your beautiful light in one place or something. But we ended up kind of not really doing that.
We left all the street lights on, we turned more lights on to make more multiple shadows, and then, you know, didn't use a lot of fill. I think that's why it kind of feels real. Watchmen-y.
Creating Manhattan, I think first and foremost, is a leap of faith, especially all the ways that people talk about making him or have talked about making him over the years.
I wear a sweatsuit that has little blue lights taped to it. On it are little tracking markers.
So these markers allow a computer later on to track each motion independently. It's sort of a barcode for a human body and motion capture. All of this circuitry controls each zone, allows us to change brightness, so if we need more brightness in one spot and not in another. See, we even have LEDs in the bottom of his feet, and that's so that when he steps, we actually see light in his footprint.
One other aspect of Dr. Manhattan that's really, really important is the fact that he glows blue. Thousands of LEDs that put out this nice diffuse light that can light everything around him. It's become a major lighting source in the movie in some scenes.
Whenever Laurie, for example, would talk to Dr. Manhattan, all the sparkle in her eyes became more magical and did half the lighting for us sometimes.
They paint little dots on my face every day that are also tracking markers.
We're going to do 34 expressions.
Okay.
After we do those expressions, we're going to do something called a range of emotion expressions.
Okay.
And it's something like happy,
Right.
sad, anger, and it's going to encompass all the expressions.
A lot of it just comes from how fantastic you think this creature is, or this character is in the movie, and you realize that he's a fully CG character that's going to be informed by Billy's performance.
Essentially, my performance will be erased from the film, and the computer animators will create a Manhattan version of me, and then they'll make it really big and cool.
We're in Dr. Manhattan's lab. He's going to be 45 feet tall in here. And this balloon light that you see up there is going to represent the light that Dr. Manhattan gives out when he's that tall. Because he's a CG character through the whole movie, and we can easily make him 45 feet tall. But then he's got to shrink down and become Billy's size. There's a lot of stuff that happens on the set and off the set that goes into keeping the essence of his performance and puts him into this character. It's been an interesting process to carry on from the initial test phase and get to the perfect Dr. Manhattan look and put him into the scene. We've had a lot of discussions in their screening room about how to downplay it and keep it really true to how Billy is doing the performance, and it's a lot in the face. We smile a lot in the screening room because it's just kind of freaky, you know.
One of the brilliant things about the graphic novel are all the little Easter eggs and the attention to detail. The more we can ground the movie in the real world, and the more we can bring it back to things relating to pop culture, it just further reminds the audience what this world that we're creating is.
Newsstand is the nexus of all of the threads of the story in many ways. You know, almost all the characters come past this corner with the newsstand on it, and a lot of the commentary takes place here through the media, through the dialogue with the young boy.
We find the time, the period, and we try to nail it. But more so, we try to blend in with the set decoration, the art direction, the special effects, what's going on. We give it a little bit of oomph. A lot of times, we just let it blend in.
We have acres of research, particularly all these flashback sequences, which are just minuscule 3, 4, 5 second shots. They have to pinpoint the period and say that moment, and it's moments that at least everybody from my generation will recognize.
And a lot of the prop actually says something that adds to the story or adds to the character.
The smallest prop, whether it be a framed newspaper article on a wall or a poster on the side of a building, it was important for us to relate back to the graphic novel.
These characters are not just very kind of, muscle-bound, one-dimensional characters. They really do, they have a past, and that's a lot what the film is about, the past and the effects on the present.
The favorite prop we made is probably the Rorschach grappling gun. You know, it's just such a fantasy.
3, 2, 1, go! And they're really like...
When you meet with Zach, who's exceptional because he is such a visionary, he's one of these people that actually draws his own storyboards. I would go through the script and just the manufacturing things. I would list them, and we would talk about the characters and what he thinks it should be, and I give my input. So it's a process of just honing everything down, and then we'll come up with a certain concept.
The majority of the people on the show are very, very familiar with the story inside and out. A lot of them came to the table with a Watchmen experience already under their belt. People knew the characters, they knew the world, they knew the locations, they knew the ideas.
Every single department had something to contribute and lots of details that they could research and sink their teeth into. Wardrobe, hair and makeup, props. It really created such excitement to be able to get at this thing.
This show is so complicated that in order to tell the story, I just feel that they've broken all the rules just to do it.
You know, it's funny because Carl and I were so close in age, we just thought this is going to be crazy, you know, you're going to be playing my mother. But it worked out quite nicely, and I think it just became such a natural relationship between the two of us.
I think there's a lot of the element of living through her daughter, which is, you know, a classic mother-daughter dynamic.
I mean, it's my feeling that Sally, yes, great crime fighter, but longed for something more.
Even though she has been an overbearing mother and she's projected a lot onto her child, and even though there's a lot of tension in our relationship, in the end of the day, she'd give her life for her in a second.
The interesting thing about Sally is that she represents to me any sort of the golden age of superheroes, you know, that where they were almost like movie stars, right?
In her world, she was just using what she had to get ahead in life, to have this great exhibitionist, escapist persona.
No matter how fantastic her costume was, or no matter how much she loved to pose for a picture, she still was putting herself in danger. She still was out there actually getting the bad guys, you know, and using her feminine wiles to do that. You know, by the 1980s, she's in her mid-60s, and there's a lot of sort of drama that's self-induced, and she's also been through a lot. There's a lot of pain there.
And I think with Laurie, it's accepting all the things that her mother has put on her, you know, all that baggage she carries about this is who you are.
You see her mother, who's a broken down woman who's been through a lot, and Laurie comes out sort of and breaks that cycle and comes out on top.
Laurie sort of resents her mother for pushing her into being a superhero. But it's only through the course of the film that she realized that, you know, it wasn't her mother, you know, it was her.
You know, you watch Silk Spectre, and she fights like a man, and she's a strong, powerful woman, and kind of gives that female power, that woman power, that myself as a woman, you just kind of go, wow, that's really cool. I wanted to learn how to do this properly, so the stunt coordinator and all his team, you know, they started training me.
With Laurie, and if I go specific style, she would have more of a wushu, Chinese, Filipino collie style, but with some power base as well.
I wanted to do the stunts. I didn't want to have my stunt double do it. I wanted to do it. I wanted to feel it.
Once she gets her costume on, like the old days, and she's standing there in a burning building, you realize that this is her gift, you know, is that this is what she does, you know, and she's pretty awesome, kicks ass, it's awesome. Rorschach is this sort of detective of the story, but at the same time he is psychopathic in his relentless pursuit of justice, or whatever that is.
I mean, it's a guy that just really had a horrible childhood. You know, his mother was a prostitute. She didn't even know Walter's dad's last name. It's gotta not be fun being Rorschach. Because he's been through so much, and where he got tweaked, it's difficult. I don't know that it's one spot, you know? It's just a series of events.
The world is not black and white, so he faces these sort of moral dilemmas every moment, and he's constantly having to sort of reevaluate his own take. Interesting that the character Rorschach, the most loved character as far as fandom goes, is also the character that is the most maniacal and insane, but also sort of unloved.
It is a challenge trying to find those cues that will translate, you know, well from still cartoon imagery to live, moving real people.
Is a vigilante that's all about sort of a black and white moral code, and sort of illustrate that he has a black and white mask that changes and creates different sort of Rorschach patterns on his face as he makes his way through a dark and, in his opinion, morally bankrupt world.
Jackie captures his physique so beautifully with his particular trench coat and his pinstripe fabric that we dyed especially to be our Rorschach purple. Yeah, it's interesting. The evolution of Rorschach's mask was a long and complex one. We developed a printing process onto a fantastic four-way lycra that enabled us to get a great stretch and that beautiful smooth egg-like silhouette that you see in the graphic novel, but at the same time have a sense of a dimensionality and a texture that we printed onto the lycra.
Performing with a sock on my head is what I always say.
The eye holes are very, very large, so you can read the eyebrows and the expression in the eyes.
The idea is so that I can see what's going on, and that so the guys that are actually putting the blood on there can also just see emotionally what was going on during the performance.
He wears that, he emotes, he does everything, and then we take it back into the shop and we track the tracking markers and we replace everything on the face. There are set patterns that define his expressions. Alex McDowell in the art department created about 13 to 15 different hero patterns.
You know, and I think it's that way in the graphic novel as well. If you kind of look at the various blots, it is tied to what's going on with them.
We realized, well, if we're going to be faithful to the graphic novel, we should look at what Dave Gibbons drew, because he was actually pretty specific about what blots he would put into each panel and how they would change sometimes. We wanted to get that level of detail into the film as well. We actually go through a hand-drawn 2D process first, and those are all animated flat. They give us back a sequence, and we look at a high-con version of the sequence. Once we buy off on that animation, we already know how it gets rendered, and then it's just all lighting for the actual textured head that we're replacing in the scene.